It hasn't, in fact, gone much below 35,000 a year since the 1950s. I mean, this is a country used to making some progress. Now, I recognize that much of this lies with local and state authorities, but I'd like to ask all of you, and I'll begin with Ms. Hamady, but it's a question for all of you. What, in your view, and I recognize that there are many things that each of you think should be done, but I'm trying to focus on major things now. What is the single most important thing that you think Congress can do to reduce the number of roadway fatalities, bearing in mind that state and localities are where the action is? So could I start with Ms. Hamady and just go on down the line?
Thank you very much for the question, and it's hard for the NTSB to pick one thing over another. So something I will say is it's a comprehensive approach. From our standpoint, it's effective guidance to the states, it's enforcement, high visibility enforcement, education for drivers and others, and engineering, and that includes vehicle technologies, other technologies like collision avoidance systems, speed limiters, and better data.
Yes, sir. Mr. Jones, Vice Mayor Jones.
Thank you. Again, I think it has a lot to do with priorities and accountability. I think there's a lot of great tools in the toolbox to do good design. We have great examples of where we have retrofitted our streets to make them accessible and safe for all users. But I think there's often, again, I mentioned there's this disconnect between these large policy frameworks and the actual implementation. Sometimes I think it has a lot to do with just the culture. You know, engineers are often trained and their priorities are about moving cars as quickly and efficiently through communities as possible. And I think there needs to be a greater focus in on sort of changing the paradigm a little bit and prioritizing funding to do things like complete streets. I mean, Florida DOT, for example, the state has a wonderful complete streets policy, but what ends up happening is that by the time it gets down to the local or to the district level, a lot of times it falls on the wayside. And I think what we need is some more accountability to say, look, we can do these projects. Let's put a pot of funding that's dedicated solely to this effort and start to do more demonstration projects so people can see the benefits of these types of improvements and retrofits.
Chief Brown.
Very briefly, I would say that, frankly, we should really change the narrative from the standpoint, and I put this in my written comments, to drive home the importance of what we're talking about. A lot of times the threat to the public and the individual road users, whether they be pedestrians, bikes, or motorists, is lost in the discussion of the authorization regarding roadway use and road construction and everything else. I put in my testimony a comment that I truly believe, and I've said many times over: when you knock on a door and you wake somebody up and you tell them they've lost a loved one or a friend, it doesn't matter if it's a bullet or a fender. The same shock is there. Our officers across this country deal with that on a daily basis, as do professionals in the medical field that do it at a hospital. And yet, we ignore this as a national issue. What we compete with in the law enforcement arena are other public health and public safety issues. The opioid task issue is a huge issue across this country. We're dealing with it. But no one says it in the same loud depth and a voice as it applies across this country, and yet it affects so many people and so many families. That's the national narrative, I think, that, frankly, Congress could tee up and charge all of us to do better at.
Mr. Burma.
The Highway Safety Improvement Program requires data-driven results from state DOTs. DOTs have data on where accidents happen. They lack the funding a lot of times to combat the problem. I think that's probably one of the most useful systems that Congress has at its disposal, is the ability to identify where crashes happen, where fatalities happen, and the ability to take action and provide results.
Mr. Sewell.
I'd like to echo a lot of what Mr. Jones has said. We have great tools currently as engineers and planners of our transportation network. The biggest issues are the data sets that we're using to identify where those issues could occur, and then the funding is always an issue. So I think for Congress to show leadership on both how we're attacking these to be more proactive and keep people safe, as well as the pot of money that can be allocated towards safety projects are the two biggest things for me.
I'm going to allow Mr. Smith to answer briefly.
Of course. I certainly agree with everything that's been said here on the panel, and it really comes back down to the culture and addressing the culture. We wouldn't accept this in the aviation industry, and we can't accept it on our roadways.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now recognize the ranking